You literally have 1 degree of separation between Joe Biden, his family's finances, and the Chinese gangs that are involved in these fentanyl operations.
Hello everyone, it's Steve Hilton here, and this is the Big Ideas Book Club. Our guest today, Peter Schweizer, he's the author of Blood Money, Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. Wait till you hear what Peter has to say. The details in this book about China's efforts to undermine our country, absolutely shocking. I thought I knew pretty much everything there was to know about this. I was absolutely stunned by some of the details. So here he is now, Peter Schweizer, author of Blood Money. Peter Schweizer, great to see you. Tell us, what's the big idea?
The big idea is America's on fire, China's holding an empty can of gasoline, and our leaders are silent.
I mean, it's just so terrifying when you think about the way this is, I was going to say crept up on us, but it hasn't, because you, of all people, you've been chronicling this for so long. Give us some of the specific examples where our leaders have just been, I think the word is complicit, right? I mean, that's the basic point you're making. They've been complicit in China's rise, and China has been explicitly clear about their goal to displace us as the main superpower in the world and the number one economy and the most dominant country.
Yeah, and they're engaged in aggressive actions that are resulting in the deaths of Americans. Take the fentanyl crisis, now the leading cause of death for people under the age of 45. People view this as kind of a Mexican drug cartel operation. They're actually the junior partners. This is run by the CCP. People know that the precursors come from China, but they're offloaded in the port of Manzanillo. 90% of them are. At that port, it's a Chinese-run terminal. They take those precursors up to a town in northern Mexico, where, according to our government, 2,000 Chinese nationals help the drug cartels turn these precursors into fentanyl. They deliver them in the form of pills. People think they're taking a Vicodin or an Adderall when they're not. They're taking fentanyl, and that's why they're dying. Those pill presses and pill molds are sold to the cartels by Chinese at cost. They're not price gouging them. The drug cartels need secure communications. China provides them with Chinese apps, Chinese communication devices that are encrypted. The cartels like these because they know that the Chinese will not share those communications with U.S. law enforcement. And the money laundering process. In the old days for the drug cartels of cocaine and heroin, they used Latin American banks. They now use Chinese state-owned banks to launder the money, and they oftentimes will use Chinese students in the United States on education visas to do so. So this is a Chinese operation. And then you look at various figures, Joe Biden being one of them. You literally have 1 degree of separation between Joe Biden, his family's finances, and the Chinese gangs that are involved in these fentanyl operations. In 2017, Steve, the Biden family received a $5 million interest-free forgivable loan from a Chinese businessman. The Bidens do not refute this. That man was business partners with a Chinese gangster called White Wolf, who set up the Sinaloa cartel in the fentanyl trade. So it's a little surprise to me that Joe Biden does not want to have a conversation about China's involvement in the fentanyl crisis.
It's amazing. I mean, the level of detail you've just laid out is, you don't see this anywhere else. There's no one else who is setting it out in this way. I want to go back into some of that detail, and then every aspect of it, actually, both the fentanyl operation and then the Biden connection. Most people, I think now, because the fentanyl crisis has become so prevalent in communities across the country, I think would be aware, they are aware of the China connection, and they're aware that somehow the chemicals come from China. But the degree of planning and sophistication, I want to go back into that. So to someone who's just a casual observer, they may think, well, just like you have drug cartels and criminal gangs in Mexico, and we all know how drugs, that's been a fact of life for decades. But in terms of the Chinese aspect of it, people might have assumed, well, it's just criminals in China, in the same way that it's criminals in Mexico, criminals here in America. But it sounds like it's not that. It's actually much more organized by the Chinese regime.
Yeah, that's correct. And part of it is that the CCP and the Chinese triads or mafia, as it were, basically struck up an alliance in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. He met with senior leaders of those criminal gangs and said, look, if you are patriotic, meaning you support the CCP and you do favors for us overseas, we will allow you to
Wow.
operate in China, but just make sure that you sell the drugs overseas and you engage in the criminal activity outside of China. If you look at President Xi has family members that are linked to Chinese organized crime. Some have been active in Australia, for example. And then when you look at how the CCP is structured, they set up these advisory bodies, consultative bodies at a very senior level for people who are not CCP party members but are helpful to the party. And it's a very, very prestigious appointment to get. Those are populated by individuals who are known senior members of these criminal gangs. And there was a gang leader, his last name was Juan. He went by the name Broken Tooth. They all have these sort of strange gangster like names. Broken Tooth was actually sanctioned by the Biden administration in 2021 for his involvement in the fentanyl trade, which meant that he could have no commercial activities in the United States. 3 months after he was publicly sanctioned by our Treasury Department, the CCP gave him an award. And during the speech, he talked about the fact how he was proud of what he was doing and how he was helping China in its competition with the United States. So this is not about criminal activity that the CCP doesn't know about and can't control. This is actually part of the business model, this cooperation between the gangs and the CCP.
Fascinating. I mean, all of this is so fascinating. Deng Xiaoping, of course, was the leader who was, has been widely praised, all around for being the one that opened up China's economy, kept the political control in the hands of the Communist Party, but said, we need to embrace capitalism in order to grow our economy and raise the living standards of our citizens. Is seen as a sort of kindly old gentleman in many ways. He met I remember when he met the Queen, and it was all, what a sweet old man, with a twinkle in his eye. And the thing is that makes total sense, because that is to me an exact parallel. I want to come to TikTok later, but an exact parallel in a way with TikTok, where they're basically saying the same with TikTok, which is, oh, do whatever you want, like poison the cultural bloodstream of America with all that you can do overseas with TikTok. But what TikTok in China has to be very wholesome, and it's a very different product. In the same way, they're saying he said to the gangs, do whatever you want overseas and actually do things that actually help us dominate the rest of the world, but just don't do it in China. It's very, very similar. Can I ask you then about fentanyl specifically? Would you say that it's accurate to describe it as a plot to poison America, that it was actually designed? Is it more opportunistic in the sense that the regime saw that this was going on and said, yeah, let's encourage it? Or was it actually something that, pardon the kind of pun, as it were, cooked up as a specific strategy to undermine America?
Well, there would be no massive fentanyl trade by the Mexican drug cartels without the Chinese equation. If you look at the history of this, China and the CCP have been involved in the drug trade in the past. Actually, in the 1990s, I talk about this in Blood Money. In the 1990s, Joe Biden at a Senate hearing called out the CCP for their involvement in the heroin trade. And he was criticizing the George H.W. Bush administration for failing to do something about it. So people have known about China basically accepting this as a weapon. But when you got to synthetic opioids, of which, of course, fentanyl is one, it completely changed the business model. And the Chinese organized crime figures went to the drug cartels, they went to the Sinaloa cartel, they went to El Chapo, and they said, look, here's a way where we can take the profit margin and make it 20 times greater than it was with heroin or cocaine. In other words, you don't have to grow all these plants on these big plots and transport all this stuff. We can give you chemicals, you can put it in a lab, and you can make it, and you're going to make 20 times as much money. Now, by the way, you're going to end up killing some of your customers. But the cartels were like, that's fine. The profit margin's 20 times the stake. We don't care if we lose some of our customers. China accomplished its goal, which I believe is revenge for the opium wars of the 19th century. That's still something they talk about and obsess about. Fentanyl is a way to sort of replay that and augur in what they hope will be a century of humiliation for the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because this is the thing that people have to understand is that the if you read the speeches of especially Xi Jinping, who's just emerged as this, absolute Chinese nationalist dictator of the old school, who's very, very clear about his goal to make China dominant. That is the objective.
Yeah.
Now, they deny this. And in fact, I mean, just the latest meeting with Biden and Xi was in San Francisco. Again, they talked about, Chinese cooperation in doing something about it. But I mean, they've said that before. They said that to President Trump, I believe.
Yeah.
And all the observers, I mean, I'm even, NPR, constant defender of the Biden administration, reporting around the time of that summit saying, yeah, well, they haven't really done anything at all. So it's lip service, isn't it? But they do assert that they're trying to do something about it.
Yeah, they do. I mean, there are two things that I think are particularly important in this regard. The first thing is President Xi himself, and I talk about this in the book. President Xi reveres his father, who was a
Hmm.
revolutionary leader with the CCP, close to Mao. He was caught up in a purge, and then he was rehabilitated. But President Xi built a large mausoleum in honor to his father. One of his father's, very interesting, one of his father's most courageous acts, I'm going to put courageous in quotation marks, according to President Xi, was his father, when he was 14 years old, tried to poison his teacher, who was not sufficiently revolutionary. That's something that President Xi views as sort of a heroic act. To me, that's indicative of this kind of mindset when it comes to these issues. I think the second thing that needs to be said is that, look, this is a country that is a totalitarian state. Doesn't mean that there aren't activities that go on that they don't know of. But if you look at the companies that are sending the precursor chemicals, for example, from China to Mexico, 40% of them are state owned companies, and many
Wow.
of them are politically connected. I mean, they're owned by high ranking CCP officials. So the notion that they would somehow do something in defiance of what the government wants is absolutely absurd. So, Joe Biden has not called them out. The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, on CBS News last year jokingly claimed that maybe some of these precursors were being shipped to Mexico by mistake. This is willful blindness. This is choosing not to see, because if this is true, and it is true, Steve, you cannot have a normal, ordinary relationship with this country as long as it's going on. You can't say, let's have a cultural exchange, let's talk about trade issues, if they are complicit and involved in poisoning and killing basically 100,000 Americans every year.
Yes, 100. I mean, people have used the term. I mean, chemical warfare. That's effectively what it is. It's chemicals, and they're literally sending them into the country, and they are aware that it's killing people,
Yeah.
and they're continuing to do it. Can we go back to the details of the supply chain a little bit
Yeah.
and just go into that? So the specific the port where they arrived,
Yeah.
it, the chemicals arrived. Just talk about that a bit more, and then I was very interested in your point about the Chinese nationals who are helping in the labs.
Yeah, yeah. So the precursors from China, 90% of them, according to our DEA, arrive in the Port of Manzanillo, which is on the western coast of Mexico. That international terminal is run by a company called Hutchison, which is the controlling shareholder in that company is Li Ka-shing, a long known businessman in Hong Kong,
Hmm.
has certainly cozied up to the CCP. By the way, has also been identified in Canadian and US intelligence reports publicly as linked to Chinese organized crime. So that's very, very interesting. So there's no question you have corruption in Mexico, in the sense that Mexican authorities aren't doing their job. But I think it is quite convenient that these precursors are going into an international terminal in Mexico that is run by a company, Hutchison, that has these ties through Li Ka-shing and is also close to the Chinese state, the
Hmm.
Chinese military industrial state.
And then the labs.
Yeah, then the labs. So you have precursors. You need to get them into a laboratory and create this terrible cocktail. That's done in northern Mexico. And again, according to our federal government's intelligence reports, and I've seen videos of these, it's actually Chinese nationals produce most of these cocktails or effectively function as chemists to produce this poison. How these 2,000 Chinese nationals ended up in northern Mexico, I have no idea. But again, I think it's pretty clear that Chinese organized crime plays a role. There was a Chinese businessman linked to Chinese organized crime that was arrested a few years ago in Mexico who was involved in this. It was a Mexican government U.S. joint operation. When they arrested this guy, Steve, they found in a massive room about the size of a warehouse $571 million in cash. And this is a guy that was involved in these efforts. So these are politically connected individuals. These are not guys with face tattoos
Yeah.
that are detached. These are people that have close friends in the Chinese military that sit on these advisory boards. It is an integrated movement as a whole. And again, they give awards to these people when they're identified by our government and sanctioned by our government for their involvement in this deadly trade.
So let's turn to the Biden connection. You're the person that exposed all of this, all of the, if you should understand everything we know about the Biden family's years-long exploitation of Joe Biden's public office for private gain and being in bed with foreign governments, including hostile foreign governments like China. You're the one who exposed all of that, Peter. So let's just make sure everyone's aware of that.
Well, thank you,
Tell us
Steve.
the latest in this book and how it connects to the fentanyl issue.
Yeah, I think it's in this $5 million loan. Yi Yiming, this Chinese businessman, gave the Bidens a $5 million loan, and I say not Hunter Biden, the Bidens, because on the Hunter Biden laptop, the communication from Yi Yiming is that this is a loan to the Biden family, not just to Hunter. And it was an interest-free, forgivable loan. Who doesn't want a loan like that? That has never been repaid. And we know that the money was transferred. The problem is that Yi Yiming was also business partners with Zhang Anlo, who also goes by the name White Wolf, who's the head of UBG, this Chinese criminal gang that in Mexico and in the United States, it has been widely reported, UBG and White Wolf set up the Sinaloa cartel in the fentanyl trade back in 2012, 2013. To me, that is one of the reasons why Joe Biden does not want to confront China on this issue. He's concerned about blowback. He's concerned about appearances. So he just simply wants this issue to go away. And it's shocking to me. I mean, now, Donald Trump raised this issue in his administration. He raised it with Xi. Xi said he would take care of it. Of course, he didn't. I think Trump was naive in believing that his deal-making ability would solve this problem. It hasn't. But at least Trump brought it up publicly. Joe Biden won't. He's explicitly said there will be no finger pointing. And that to me is a massive, massive failure in leadership, because that's one of the basic functions of government, should be to protect us from these kinds of actions.
So the $5 million it's basically ended up as a donation, a gift.
Correct. Now, for tax purposes, the Biden family will probably insist that it's still a loan. See, this is the beauty of, instead of, if you give somebody $5 million and they don't pay taxes on it, then you are in deep trouble. That's tax evasion. If I loan you $5 million, Steve, it's not income to you. And if we pretend it's not been paid, it's forgivable, it's kind of a blur, we can carry this on for years without you actually paying income taxes on it. By the way, it also gives me additional leverage, as it would, this Chinese businessman, to say, hey, you're not doing what I want, give me my $5 million back. So it's a very, very skillful, corrupt way to buy influence and silence at the same time.
I mean, look, the China threat, let's call it that, across the board, in the most deadly form, the fentanyl issue that we've discussed, but also when it comes to trade, and we'll get to TikTok, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
Donald Trump really put that on the political agenda. Before Trump, the whole kind of political consensus, both parties, the establishment, business, everyone was like, yeah, you got to suck up to China. We got to be in bed with them for economic reasons. It's the only way to do it. And if we do that, then it will become more like us, and they'll be more democratic, and everything will be fine. And Trump called BS on that, and he's completely right, and has revealed the extent of the aggression. Trump really focused on the economic aspects. And now everyone agrees, right? You can't find a single person who sort of at least doesn't say, "Oh yes, of course, the China threat. We've got to do something about the China threat," even though all these people were pushing China engagement for years beforehand. But I mean, so it's on the radar as a political issue. But since Trump first put it there, and you exposed the corruption that underlies the establishment engagement with China, what's your take on how it's going? I mean, is everyone sort of talking about the China threat, but underneath all that, it's business as usual, or what would you say is going on?
No, that's a great question. I think it is business as usual. I also think that many people talking about this in the West are mischaracterizing it. What do
Hmm.
I mean by that? They're viewing the China threat as sort of a traditional, conventional, kinetic war threat. So the response is we need more missiles, we need more tanks, we need more aircraft. I'm not saying I'm opposed to that. We need to have a strong military, but that's not China's play. They have embraced what they call disintegration warfare, or they've called unrestricted warfare. And it's straight out of the philosophy of Sun Tzu, the strategist everybody likes to quote online, which is the best strategist is the one who defeats his enemy without actually fighting him.
Hmm.
That's actually the quote on disintegration warfare, which is a book written by two senior military officers. And what they say is, look, if we go to war with the United States, we'll kill a lot of them, they'll kill a lot of us, we'll have a lot of economic damage. Why don't we do what we can to hobble this country, sow division, sow dissent, sow chaos, sow a lack of distrust? And that, I would argue, is the major threat. So while we're
Hmm.
focused on aircraft carriers and how many the Chinese will have in the next 10 years, they are using fentanyl. They are using Glock switches, these small devices that you insert into a Glock handgun, which turns a Glock handgun into a fully automatic machine gun, highly illegal in the United States. The Chinese have been smuggling these into the United States since 2018, according
Wow.
to the Department of Homeland Security. And Steve, they're marketing them to criminal gangs and drug dealers in the United States. So we've seen the rise of machine gun fire in American streets that we haven't seen since the days of Al Capone. So there are multiple things they are doing right now. We're preparing for the next war. We need to be focused on what they're doing right now. And it's not to fight a kinetic war, it is to sow chaos and dissension within the United States.
By the way, I want to get back to that and any other examples you have. I hadn't heard that. That's a fascinating detail. Um, but it just, as you were speaking, it just reminded me of it's almost the reverse strategy potentially. Also, there's a similarity to where the Soviet Union, where we then in the 80s with Reagan had a strategy which some people described as arming them to death. In other words, we would build up our military, they would try and match it, but of course they're poorer, and in the end, trying to match the US military buildup bankrupted the Soviet Union and forced its collapse. You could almost see the same thing in reverse now with China, where we were massively in debt, most of it to China, and they're building up their military. So that in Washington, we got to build up our military and spend all this money we don't have, even more borrowing to pay for a military buildup. Meanwhile, they're really winning through these insidious tactics that we're just not really focused on.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and the book is divided into four sections,
Hmm.
which sort of takes the phraseology and the philosophy that China has before these elements. So, for example, the section on fentanyl, we were talking about how China runs this supply route, but it's really we're focused on Mexico. The concept there in Chinese strategy is murder with a borrowed knife.
Uh-huh.
If I'm going to murder somebody, I'm going to borrow your knife, Steve, so people think you're the one that's actually doing it. When it comes to this social chaos in America, these Glock switches encouraging violence, the other thing they do, Steve, is they have these massive operations with Chinese military personnel, thousands of them. Each one has thousands of social media accounts that are posing as Americans. And I've got numerous examples in the book. So you're literally talking about millions of social media accounts on X, on Facebook, on YouTube, you name it. And what do? Half of them literally say America's a hopelessly racist, bigoted society. The other half are saying, I only like white people. I don't like minorities. And why are they doing this? They are trying to magnify the racial tension and division in America. If there's an optimistic note in this book, it's I don't think we're actually as divided on those issues as you would think we are going in social media. The strategic concept here is watch the fire burn from across the river. In other words, there's a fire burning over there. You may have started it, you may have fanned the flames, but you deny because no, we're on the other side of the river. We have nothing to do with that. This is part of what they are doing to try to weaken the United States. And I quote a Chinese military official as saying these divisions in America are sapping them of their strength.
Hmm.
And I think he's right.
So that, I mean, that sounds like that. Would this be an accurate characterization? Is a much more organized and sophisticated and large scale version of what we first heard about around the time of the 2016 election with interference. And obviously, the media obsessed about Russian interference, but
Yeah.
but it wasn't just Russia. Iran was doing it, China's doing it, and so on. Um, but it sounds like what's happening now with the Chinese regime is way, way bigger and more sophisticated than anything we've seen before.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, yes, Russia has done this, but they don't have the resources, they don't have the capability, they don't have the manpower to engage in it in the scale that China does. And they frankly don't have the sophistication. I mean, not to stereotype, but when it comes to Russian intelligence, subtlety is not a word that often comes to mind. That's the essence of a lot of what China does. So they want this kind of division. A couple of the most violent radical protest groups in 2020 and are the same groups, by the way, that are now leading a lot of these pro-Hamas protests. Are a group called FRSO and PSL, Freedom Road Socialist Organization and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. These are both parties that have pledged their allegiance to the CCP. We know that they communicate. We know that there is indirect funding that flows to them. We know that China tracks what these organizations are doing. There was a Chinese report, I quote in the book, even saying their assessment that FRSO had taken over BLM and was steering those protests in an increasingly violent way. So China wants these things to occur, and they view this as an opportunity to really undermine the United States and to sap us of our confidence and our sense of unity of purpose.
So, what are the platforms doing about this? I mean, we hear all the time that they're working to get rid of bots. Now, is bots even the right term to describe this? Why aren't we doing a better job of rooting this out?
Well, I think some of them are certainly trying. I mean, Twitter in 2020, and obviously I'm critical of Twitter in 2020 for a variety of reasons. They did delete 170,000 Twitter accounts that were linked to these Chinese efforts. But those are pretty easy to find, Steve. What they found was that these quote unquote Americans, and they had absurd names like Hot Bella MAGA. They had these absurd names, but they were only tweeting from 9 to 5 Beijing time. So it didn't fit with this being American. So those are easy to identify. So I think they do try to make efforts, but frankly, it's very, very hard to do. And the Chinese are getting more and more sophisticated about it. And I think it's a very real problem, the way that they're masking it. And again, they're trying to take a conversation that we can legitimately have about, DEI, about, affirmative action, about policies in America. And they don't want us to have a civilized, normal conversation about it. They want it to be about hate on both sides. And they are absolutely magnifying.
I mean, it's just, this is the strategy. They're poisoning us, as the phrase goes, literally and figuratively. That's what they're clearly doing here. I mean, it's amazing. These details are incredible. Can I ask you to talk about TikTok for a bit, because obviously that's dominated the discussion, really the political discussion. I mean, what you've just been describing is not TikTok; it's all the other platforms. What's your take on the whole TikTok discussion?
Yeah, I think you have to understand that ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, is not even just a normal Chinese company that's under the control of the CCP. It is unique in a couple of aspects. Number one, this algorithm that drives TikTok that is so addictive and so precise in each person is not only a ByteDance secret. The Chinese government in 2019 designated it as a state secret. And part of the reason is because ByteDance and the Chinese state work together. They do joint research. The Chinese Ministry of State Security, which is their spy apparatus, and ByteDance do regular research together on artificial intelligence. And that research includes, in their words, how to manipulate people online. So ByteDance is a different sort of company than it is for others. The other way is the way that it's structured. I mean, Rand Paul and some other people have said, well, there are American shareholders. They own 60% of the shares. What he's either willfully or naively not taking into account is that these foreign investors, American investors, are not the controlling shareholders of ByteDance, but even more critically, Fortune magazine and others have reported on this. All of those American investors signed an agreement when they bought into the company that if they made disparaging or negative comments about ByteDance, their stakes could be seized by the Chinese government. So they're not even allowed. I mean, for somebody to say, well, ByteDance in the name of free speech, which it allowed to operate, they wouldn't even allow their shareholders to speak honestly about the company. So that's the way it's structured. The other thing I would say is, while we're debating here about, is TikTok a threat? What do they do? What I've done in the book is actually quoted extensively from Chinese officials, military officers, people that work at the Ministry of Propaganda, and they are not having this debate in China. They view, and one military official calls TikTok the ultimate Trojan horse to use against the West. And there are numerous extensive quotes in the book about how exactly they manipulate young people in the West. They're not going to spread propaganda by having placards of Chairman Mao videos. They're far more sophisticated than that. They talk about how TikTok is the ideal platform to appeal to the emotion of young people. And when you appeal to their emotion and they become emotional, they embrace this as righteous indignation on their own behalf. And these propagandists say, once you have that, you've got them, because they think they arrived at this idea by themselves, and now we can manipulate them. And they describe the various ways in which they are manipulating them already. So it's not a question of if this is going to happen. It's already happening. The Chinese are talking openly about it. And I would encourage people to read it for themselves. These are from Chinese sources, and I give you the sourcing for it where you can find it yourself.
Well, again, like so prescient, because I mean, you've been working on all this for years and working on the book, and now it's in the news. But I mean, you've been ahead of the game on all of this stuff. Last question, Peter, before I ask you to tell the audience where they can get the book and follow your work and so on. I mean, any other kind of juicy nuggets you just want to that we haven't discussed, because I'm sure there's a wealth of information in the book. That's why everyone has to read it. Any last thoughts that you want to share?
Well, I'll give two, if that's okay, if I'm allowed. The first one is probably the biggest surprise I found, is that we have this debate in the U.S. about trans issues. And one of the things that I was surprised to find is that two of the biggest funders of the trans movement in the United States are actually Chinese-based billionaires, which was surprising to me. Neither one of these individuals is trans. They don't have family members that are trans. But here's the real troubling part, Steve, is they push these ideas in the US. They're not pushing these ideas in China.
Right.
It's only one-sided, which makes me suspicious of their motives. I name who they are, how it works, etc. That's the first one. The second one would be, there's a lot in the book about Gavin Newsom's relationship vis-a-vis China, but also specifically certain Chinese individuals that have associations with Chinese organized crime. This goes back to when he was mayor of San Francisco. He had a man on his transition team that was involved in Chinese organized crime. He put the man in charge of a Chinatown rehabilitation. That guy was a dragon head in Chinese organized crime. He became friends with and had taxpayer dollars donated to a nonprofit run by another guy who is a dragon head with Chinese organized crime. When he set up something called China SF, which was designed to bring Chinese investment dollars to the Bay Area, he could have picked any businessman in China to partner with. He picked a gentleman that was already publicly known to be linked to Chinese organized crime. And these are all Chinese organized crime networks that are involved today in the drug trade. So I think there's another reason why this politician, like Joe Biden, will not talk to China about this. Fentanyl deaths in California are up 1,600% since 2016. When Gavin Newsom went to China, he said no finger pointing. He will not confront China. And I think it's, again, because he has these embarrassing ties that he doesn't want to have to confront.
Amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. The work you do, Peter, is so. I mean, I think it's just indispensable. I mean, no one else is doing this kind of work. This is real. All these people who go on about journalism. This is real journalism. You're exposing some of the most important issues that our country faces. Tell everyone where they can get the book, where they can follow you. You're on book tour. If people can see you, just where can people get hold of information?
Yeah, you can follow me at peterschweizer.com or at Peter Schweizer on X or Twitter. The book should be available everywhere. First week, we're now in the second week. We were number one on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. They're carrying it at Costco, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, etc. So check it out, listen to it, and you can send feedback on my webpage. I love to hear people's comments about the book.
Amazing. Peter Schweizer, you are the best. Great to see you today. Thank you.
Great to see you, old friend. Thank you.